What is the Didache? Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and the Didache is a short early Christian document that basically lays out how to be a good follower of Jesus. And we have references to the Didache in early Christian writers, but we had no manuscript of the Didache until the late 19th century. In 1873, a man named Philotheos Bryennios discovered a manuscript in Constantinople of the entire Didache, and 10 years later published it. And then there were translations in English and German and French that came out in the years after that. And other fragments of the Didache have been discovered at places like Oxyrhynchus and elsewhere, but there's still only one surviving manuscript of the entire thing, which, by the way, dates to the middle of the 11th century CE, so somewhere around 1050 CE. And the Didache can be broken up into three general segments. The first 6 chapters are laying out a discourse known as the two ways, which is closely related to something that we find in the epistle of Barnabas. And many scholars think that both texts are drawing from a shared tradition about the two ways, which also resonates with the dualism we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls and other literature. And these first 6 chapters talk about positive commandments, talk about negative commandments, talk about household codes. And then in chapters 7 through 10, you have a bunch of ritual instructions, how to baptize, how to pray, how to bless the Eucharist. And then the rest of the chapters talk about the organization of the church, and mainly about how you should treat teachers and apostles and prophets. Now, this document probably dates to somewhere just before 100 CE or somewhere just after 100 CE, which means it was probably composed before several of the texts that are now in our New Testament. And who knows what would have happened if it were actually included in the New Testament. But it probably wasn't considered because it doesn't really have a good claim to apostolic authority. Although here is the first page of a translation of the document from the Loeb Classical Libraries, and you can see the first line is the teaching of the Lord through the 12 apostles to the Gentiles or the nations. So Didache means teaching or doctrine. And the fact that it is to the Gentiles or the nations suggests that this may be instructions for Gentile followers of Jesus. We probably have not yet reached the parting of the ways where Christianity became an entirely separate institution from Judaism. But in chapter 1, you have this recognition that there are 2 paths, one of life and one of death, and the difference between the 2 paths is great. And then you go through several commandments based on the Great Commandments, based on the Golden Rule, based on the Sermon on the Mount. And I want to talk about the first really interesting thing that is frequently brought up in debates about abortion. The beginning of chapter 2 says, "And now the second commandment of the teaching, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not engage in pederasty, do not engage in sexual immorality, do not steal, do not practice magic, do not use enchanted potions, do not abort a fetus or kill a child that is born." And this is our earliest evidence of Christian opposition to abortion, although it doesn't really clarify if this is conceptualized as pre-quickening or post-quickening. And in later centuries, the consensus view would be established that remained the majority view until the 19th century, that while abortion was always unseemly, it was not murder until the quickening. And then we have some interesting rules that the folks who appeal to chapter 2 of the Didache frequently gloss over when they are advocating for the authority of the Didache. Do not be one who reaches out your hands to receive, but draws them back from giving. If you acquire something with your hands, give it as a ransom for your sins. Do not doubt whether to give, nor grumble while giving, for you should recognize the good paymaster of the reward. Do not shun a person in need, but share all things with your brother, and do not say that anything is your own. For if you are partners in what is immortal, how much more in what is mortal? And this would obviously align with the ideal that is discussed in Acts chapters 4 and 5, where the people had all things in common and didn't think of anything as being possessed exclusively by them. And then we have some household code stuff on the same page that's related to how early Christians thought about slavery. Do not give orders to your male slave or female servant who hope in the same God out of bitterness, lest they stop fearing the God who is over you both. For he does not come to call those of high status, but those whom the Spirit has prepared. And you who are slaves must be subject to your masters as to a replica of God, with respect and reverential fear. And then later on, we get instructions about, for instance, how to bless the Eucharist. This is one of the earliest references we have to this blessing. And then in chapter 10, there's a blessing that is to be spoken after the completion of a meal that a lot of scholars believe is probably drawn from the Jewish blessing on food. And then we have the discussion of how to treat apostles. I think this paragraph is pretty interesting. But act towards the apostles and prophets as the gospel decrees. Let every apostle who comes to you be welcomed as the Lord, but he should not remain more than a day. If he must, he may stay one more, but if he stays 3 days, he is a false prophet. When an apostle leaves, he should take nothing except bread until he arrives at his night's lodgings. If he asks for money, he is a false prophet. I think that's an interesting reflection of very strict rules they had for itinerant teachers and prophets and apostles. So that's the Didache, a very important piece of early Christian literature that lays out how followers of Jesus thought you needed to behave in order to be a good follower of Jesus around the year 100 CE. Again, when many of the texts of the New Testament were still being composed. And the fit for this video has been my Data Over Dogma hoodie.